A dozen or so miles downstream from Rome, where the Tiber runs out through the marshes to the sea, stands the town of Ostia. Here, apartment blocks, shops, workshops, civic buildings and temples all survive in close proximity. So much remains, in fact, that we can see from this one site how all the disparate elements of a town fitted together to make the physical setting of the urbanized way of life that was the hallmark of Roman civilization. This is Ostia. It's a sobering thought that something like 40,000 people may have lived and worked in this small town. It measures less than 1 mile by a half. And it's impressive too that, as in most Roman towns, they were provided not only with housing, but with the full range of structures catering for all needs. I want to show you examples of the principal building types that make up this town. I'm walking along the main street, and here, beside me, is a large bathing establishment. An earlier bathhouse of the Julio-Claudian period was originally here, slightly further north. Almost next door is the theatre, backed by huge open colonnades. Next door again, 4 temples are elegantly laid out at the back of an open square. Not all the temple precincts were as neatly planned as that, but they were scattered throughout the town. And by late imperial times, there were also a good many bathing establishments, both public and private. Then there were the hundreds of small shops, like these, or these opposite the theatre. And finally, of course, buildings for local government, mostly here, about the Forum. It was the Roman achievement to spread the amenities of city living surprisingly far down the social scale. And indeed, Ostia is very much a working town, packed with warehouses like this one, and with apartment blocks here, in marked contrast to the spacious atrium houses of Pompeii or Cosa. However, before you assume that Ostia can be taken as the typical Roman town, let me explain just how special it was. It began life sometime in the 4th century BC as a fortified encampment guarding the river mouth. You can still see the outline of the camp in these streets about the city centre. This little settlement covered only about 5 acres, and building must soon have spread out along the approach roads, which, as you see, don't conform to the normal grid pattern of Roman town planning. Then, in the time of Sulla, probably around 80 BC, new walls were set round the town, and the whole area organized about a main east-west axis, the Decumanus Maximus, which crossed the other main street, the Cardo Maximus, here in the Forum. This was the town of the Julio-Claudian period, covering some 160 acres. But it was liable to frequent flooding, and so in the reign of Hadrian, much of the ground was raised and large parts of the town rebuilt. Most of the new town was laid out on the standard Roman grid, with streets dividing the space up into rectangular blocks. You can see that the whole of the excavated area is tightly packed with building. Very roughly, one can detect a business quarter with warehouses along the original river front, civic centre about the Forum, and something approaching a seaside town with a few more spacious houses down towards the original shoreline. The surrounding land would have provided food, the wooded hills probably timber for shipbuilding and repairs. The biggest local industry was almost certainly the collection of salt from pans in the tidal marshes inland. This would undoubtedly have been to supply Rome, and the whole raison d'etre of Ostia was as a service centre for the capital. Its harbours provided for transshipment of goods, principally corn, on their way upriver to Rome. The harbour was vital to Rome, but there was a problem. On this exposed and windy coast, the silty river mouth was an inadequate anchorage. Caesar planned a redevelopment, and Claudius built a huge mole. But it was not until Trajan's reign in the early 2nd century AD that this immense inland basin was constructed. Thereafter, the harbour town of Portus developed as a second settlement, while Ostia was dramatically and extensively rebuilt. The bulk of what we see now dates from the 2nd century or later, that is, well after the Augustan age. Nonetheless, we know from Vitruvius of the pressure towards vertical living in the capital, and I want to suggest that what you see here at Ostia exemplifies the final development of an urban structure that began to take shape under Augustus. Let's look at the town in detail. At Ostia, there was a relatively abrupt change from country to town. Almost the first thing you would see would be the walls, with their massively built gateways. This is the southern or Laurentum gate. The squared tufa blocks are evidence of its original size and solidity. These walls both provided security and delimited the town. I say they would be almost the first thing you would see, because, like most Roman towns, Ostia has its cemeteries outside the gates. Here, groups of substantial tombs flank the road to Rome, and with their inscriptions and offerings of flowers will have been a constant reminder to the Ostians that they were part of a continuous process of history. This is the main approach to the town. It passes through the Porta Romana into the Decumanus Maximus that runs dead straight past the theatre to the Forum. Here it crossed the other axis, the Cardo Maximus, and here, as in all Roman towns, was the focus of civic life. It is dominated by Hadrian's massive Capitolium. This replaced an earlier triple temple of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. But the Forum itself is a large, open square. At the opposite end, a temple of Rome and Augustus was built, probably by Tiberius. Only the massive substructure remains, although parts of its pediment, faced with white marble from Augustus' new quarries at Luna, have been reconstructed nearby. The Forum was flanked by the Basilica and the Curia, both richly decorated with marble, most probably under Domitian. This pillared hall of the Basilica would have served as a social and commercial centre, while across the road the town council will have met in the rather smaller Curia. These buildings formed the administrative and symbolic centre of the town, the two temples, Basilica and Curia. The spaciousness and quality of their building is in marked contrast to the housing around. Remember too that the Forum was one of the very few public open spaces in the town. The main streets provided others, as did the theatre colonnades. But more peaceful open spaces were really only to be found in the precincts attached to the temples, of which there were quite a few. We are going to look at these three. Here, the temples of the precinct of Cybele surround the private open space that the ceremonial required. Yet the precinct lies conveniently beside the thoroughfare of the Cardo Maximus. The Temple of Hercules is more typical. It was probably built around 100 BC, before ribbon development reached this far, and its east-west axis puts it at an angle to the street. The surviving base is evidence of its magnificence. Hard stone foundations, elegant mouldings, a squared tufa podium, and to the front, fine travertine steps. Yet this grand building faces only onto a cramped court which it shares with two other temples. A neater rectangular court that was actually rebuilt under Augustus fronts these four Republican temples that are packed side by side next to the theatre and hemmed in on 3 other sides by buildings. This pressure on space is very much a feature of Ostia, as it was of Augustan Rome. You can see how the buildings line the rectangular grid of streets. Though the main roads are wide enough to accommodate heavy wagons quite easily, the side streets are much more constricted. There were also alleys between the warehouses. When the walls were complete, this one must have been a lightless and unsavoury place indeed. Yet, if we think of Ostia as a working town, such unpleasantness should hardly surprise us. Warehouses were the raison d'etre of the town, and as you can see, well laid out. This is the warehouse of Hortensius, one of the earliest. The wagons passed from the street through into this spacious courtyard, surrounded by columns of tufa, with harder travertine for the corners. You remember that Ostia existed largely to supply Rome, and the most important commodity was corn. It was here, in the rooms off the main courtyard, that the corn was stored. They were long, narrow spaces, with only slit windows, but see how beautifully constructed. This is opus mixtum, that is, opus reticulatum facing, strengthened by interlocked strips of brick. Its neighbour, a mixed goods warehouse, follows the same plan, but on an irregular site and without the colonnade. Next door again, a smaller specialist warehouse was for oil or wine, stored in huge jars sunk in the floor, like these. The town had many warehouses for corn, a few specializing in wine or oil, and several for other goods. You can see how they fill much of the northern quarter, close to the waterfront. I think it's also easy to see that all this movement of goods must have been labor-intensive. We know of the existence of many different trade guilds, tugboatmen, lightermen, and so on. Surviving mosaics remind us of their work. We know, for instance, that the measurers, checking cargoes on arrival, in store, and on dispatch, formed one of the most important groups in Ostia. And I think you have to imagine the town filled with dock workers and shipping clerks. We must now look at the way they lived. By the 2nd century AD, these men and others of their rank were living in apartment blocks built over rows of shops like these. These insulae must have made the streets like narrow canyons. Yet, though they are built cheek by jowl, the join you see in the brickwork is the junction of 2 separate blocks, the 2nd century insulae of Ostia are finely constructed, of cement with hard brick facing, so good that it needed no stucco covering. This block, called the House of Diana, is typical. The ground floor is let off as shops. A passageway leads in to the communal central court, which housed the cistern, so necessary for storing fresh rainwater. It's an attractive little space, but if you imagine it surrounded by 2 or even 3 more stories, reached by this common stairway, you will have a better idea. The flats were all on the upper floors. It's difficult to make out the precise arrangement. There may well have been single-room apartments as well as others of up to 5 rooms. Most of the rooms will have had small windows, making them dark and cool like these on the ground floor. Above, only the base of the walls remain. Some of the rooms will have looked onto the court or light well, which should at least have been quieter than the street. Others, very likely with balconies, will have provided attractive views down the street. The ground floor apartments were given over to shops like these and small businesses. There are 8 in this block alone and over 800 in the whole town. Here a single room served as sales or workshop area, and a ladder led up to a wooden mezzanine floor where the shopkeeper's family would live literally over the shop, their dwelling lit by a window under the vault. The whole shop front opened directly onto the street, but could be closed by wooden shutters slotted into a groove. There were frequent hot food shops called thermopolia. This one is unusually large. The bar, by the entrance, provided drinks, and food was available inside. And all this is in fact barely 100 yards from the largest warehouse in town and less than 50 yards from the Forum. The area around the House of Diana was certainly densely inhabited, but other apartments nearby are clearly dwellings of quality. Besides the fine mosaic floors in this block, there are other indications of wealth, like the painted plaster walls on lower and upper floors. At the rear is a communal garden, rare in Ostia, and these wealthy apartments have as many as 12 rooms each. But remember that this is 2nd century building. In Augustan times, the wealthy would have lived in atrium houses, a few of which survive in the western part of the town. This is a slightly simplified plan of one called the House of Jupiter the Thunderer. It's a typical atrium house. The narrow entrance passage leads in from the street between separate shops. The centre of the house was the atrium. This was backed by the master's room, or tablinum. This, in turn, opened onto the peristyle court, all arranged on a single axis. To left and right of the tablinum, alae, or wings, opened directly onto the atrium. These would have been equivalent to our living rooms. The dining rooms and other smaller rooms were fitted in round the atrium and peristyle as convenient. This is the one we have just been looking at. From the street, we pass directly through the entrance passage to the wide atrium. Trees mark the site of the peristyle behind the walled-in tablinum. Small rooms flank the atrium. We can see the surviving impluvium as a reminder of the original opening in the roof. Some doorways have been blocked, but the ala still opens off the corner of the atrium. A similar arrangement of entrance passage, atrium and tablinum is better preserved in this late 3rd century house. The marble and the fine mosaics demonstrate the wealth of its owner. There is even a marbled-lined room with a hypocaust. We can see the hot flues that warmed the walls, a luxury denied to most flat dwellers. Here, there is a separate colonnade around the atrium, with a mosaic floor of fine quality. But we're reminded that even the wealthy had to collect their rainwater, for a cistern is let into the corner of the colonnade. In the early days of Ostia, water must have been a problem. Once the aqueduct had been built, probably in the reign of Gaius, the traditional lavish public baths could be constructed. These are the Forum baths of the late 2nd century, the largest in Ostia. But water and drainage are always crucial in town development. By the late 4th century, Ostia even had lavish public latrines such as this. Yet proper drainage must have been constructed from the start, taking rainwater and waste away to the sea. This meat market, for instance, was handsomely restored under Augustus, its courtyard centred on a communal water tank. The court was surrounded by runnels, taking water away to the main drains with their carefully cut stone covers. This shop nearby sold cooked and wet fish. The oven and water tank remain, as does the marble slab. It would have needed a good water supply to keep the produce fresh. Elaborate specialist shops of this sort were few and far between in Ostia. For instance, only 2 bakeries have been found so far in the 2/3 of the town that has been excavated. Rows of millstones would have been turned by slaves, producing large quantities of flour. The bread was probably distributed by small retailers, but the bakery itself was a big business, covering nearly 1,000 square meters, the equivalent of 6 good-sized shops. There were also 1 or 2 market buildings like this, consisting solely of groups of shops. It's an elegant little mall and consists of 18 separate units, each with the usual mezzanine floor, elegantly built and grouped round a secluded courtyard. The building dates from the reign of Hadrian and neatly demonstrates the final quality of Roman urban service building, combining simplicity with function and comfort. The buildings we have seen are not widely scattered, but cater for all the practical needs of life in Ostia. Large numbers of insulae of varying qualities housed the inhabitants. A few of the very rich had individual houses, but it was the warehouses that provided the commercial life of the town. For recreation, there were large public baths as well as a number of private ones. And then, of course, there were the bakeries, the markets and the shopping malls, and finally also the hundreds of small shops fronting the streets. The town was managed by 2 duovers and 2 aediles, supported by the council of about 100, based on the curia. There were the religious organizations, and of course a series of trade guilds, each with its own headquarters, all aspects of life tightly meshed together. 3 of these aspects, religious, social and economic, all came together in what survives as the grandest single public monument of Ostia, the theatre. Now elegantly clad in red brick, it was originally built under Augustus, probably on the initiative of Agrippa, in large blocks of tufa, some of which are visible where the cladding has fallen away. Its auditorium could seat some 3,000 spectators at the popular and free spectacles, farces and mimes. The adjoining colonnades enclosed a grand court, such as Vitruvius describes. This centred on a fine temple, while round it, the colonnades themselves enclosed rows of offices. These were used by the shippers and traders, who may have begun to gather here as early as the Augustan period. The surviving mosaics, with their images of ships and the produce they carried, are a vivid reminder of the variety and special importance of this little town at the centre of the imperial trade web.